Welcome to another episode of Friends in Wonder, where each week we explore topics we believe are relevant in today's culture. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. I'm Vince Kern.
And I'm Joe Luther. Now let's explore and wonder together. Well, hey, all right. It's the new year. It's time for 2023. The holidays are behind us, and it's time for a new episode of Friends in Wonder. And what a way to kick it off, Vince, but to talk about one of our favorite books of all time, which really is kind of a resolution of life in general, you know? And the book is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And you and I read it many, many years ago and have reread it many, many times. And we're really excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, it's one of those books that the more you read it, the more it means to you. It came out in 1997, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 10 years. It's been translated into 46 languages. It's sold, last I heard, it was over 6 million copies in the United States. It's a very seminal book. And, you know, I hear people talking about it from time to time. I'll go to the gym, and I was in the sauna a few months back, and the conversation started trending towards sort of self-growth in that. And this young woman, probably in her 30s or so, said, "Oh yeah, I just read this great book called The Four Agreements." And so it's something that a lot of people are familiar with, but maybe some people aren't.
Yeah, it's one of those go-to books. Like if you see on a website a teacher or some kind of a new age type of teacher, very often one of their books on their list is going to be The Four Agreements. And this is one that is near and dear to our hearts. And we were thinking, well, geez, if we talk about it, are we going to give it away and discourage people from wanting
Right.
from wanting to read it? But this really is no spoiler, because it's a little bit like, with all reverence to the Bible, it's a little bit like a Bible in that you can pick it up anytime and read any part of it over and over again. So our analysis of it is really more of a wet the whistle kind of an idea rather than to give you the Cliff Notes version of it.
Yeah, right. I mean, you know, if you said to say, you know, the Bible has got the tools, the 10 commandments, right? And this has got the four agreements. So if you think about them as tools, you know, if you just list the tools, and I'm just going to list the agreements right now, but if you just list the agreements, you know, the whole thing is about bringing those agreements into your life, right? So the agreements: be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. Boy, that sounds so easy, doesn't it?
Wow, talk about spoiler. All right, well, I guess we're done with this now. Well, no, it's funny. It's funny, you know, first of all, when we're going to talk about four agreements, we have to talk about agreements in general. And you mentioned the 10 commandments. When Jesus came and there was the New Testament, he created the new agreement. And so really, this is more of a Toltec version, because the writer is of South American origin, and he comes from a long line. His ancestors were Toltec. And first, let's talk a little bit about the Toltec tradition and the wisdom of the Toltec people.
Yeah, they're basically a group of scientists and artists and
Philosophers,
healers,
teachers,
philosophers, all walks of life, but they had sort of a shamanic tradition of connecting to the universe and realizing that, you know, all is one and that we're all in this together.
And the author, Don Miguel Ruiz, was, I think wasn't his grandfather or one of his grandparents was a Toltec teacher, and his mother as well.
Yep. He comes from a family of 13 children, and he was the youngest. And interestingly enough, he was sort of expected to take over the family tradition in that way. And he chose to go to medical school. But then he had a near fatal car accident and spent 9 weeks in a coma. And when he came out of the coma, he realized that his real mission, as much as he loved medicine, was to just help make a better world for everybody. And that became his passion.
Right. So, and he did a great job of it in this book. And really, so before, again, before we get into the details of each of the four agreements that you've already outlined, the idea is that the Toltec tradition discusses this idea that we have kind of a matote is what they call it, and that is this fog of brain, and it comes to us as part of our domestication as human beings, as he calls it. And this idea that we're born as kind of blank slates, almost perfect, I would say, indeed perfect. And then as we go through the domestication process, as he calls it, we get filled with all of these agreements. They're agreements that are put on us by our parents and relatives and teachers and life experiences. And then we
Rewards and punishment.
right, and then we accept them, and then we create internal judges in our brain that become our own agreement setters and become our own tongue lashers. And yeah, we talked about this a little bit in one of our previous episodes, but this is the Toltec way of seeing it. And the four agreements is a path to a new way of living forward.
Yeah, that's a really great take on this book. And, again, I think I've read it 6 or 7 times now. And I remember the very first time I read it, and I don't know which one I read first, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle or this one, but it really helped me awaken to the fact that not everything I think is true, and that really getting in touch with these four agreements and practicing them can really make a big difference, and it has.
Yeah, those are two good books to read in as kind of a beginning to reawakening your awareness, right? It's this whole idea of taking a step back and really understanding what's going on inside that busy brain of ours, right?
Right now, and I don't make too many New Year's resolutions. I'm not a big fan of them because one of the things I try to do is incorporate things on a daily basis. But having said that, every year I try and go back and read this book and really understand how it applies to my life today, and how I can use it to make tomorrow a better world for not only myself but those around me. So maybe we want to just start talking about these agreements. Joe, do you want to kick off the first one?
Well, the first one, as you said, is I think the author calls it the toughest one too, and that is be impeccable with your word. And that is a tough one because impeccable is a word that he breaks down as from the Latin terms, and basically means free of sin or without sin. And impeccable is with so that you use your word without any malintent. And we too often, as he describes in this chapter, we too often throw our words out, not realizing the impact of what we're creating when we use our word.
Mm-hmm. And again, with that biblical reference, of sin, in the Bible, it talks about how the tongue is the rudder of the heart, and what comes off out of the tongue is really what sort of is in your heart and what you believe. And you can use your words to, espouse love and all of the things that we want to do, or you can use the word to curse, blame, find guilt, destroy. And so when we do that, we don't just harm the people around us, we harm ourselves, because we're really not living in love as we want to do. And it's not easy. It is not
No,
easy to
right.
be impeccable with your word.
And the other interesting thing is that it's one thing to think about being impeccable with your word towards others, when you're actually using your mouth to utter words. But there's also the inner word, right? Because and he discusses this in this chapter, and that is that we can violate this agreement with ourselves, internalizing false agreements about ourselves is not being impeccable with the word as well. And what he does describe is that when you take the time to really honor the importance of what you're thinking and what you're saying with impeccability, it's just going to open up a whole new freedom, and you actually become almost immune from other people's attacks, because if you're truthful with your word toward self and toward others, it protects you from attack of others who are untruthful.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into agreement number 2, which is don't take anything personally. When others aren't being impeccable with their word towards us, our first response is to take it personally, and that defense mechanism comes out. And or even if they're not in an attacking mode, even if they're just taking, if you take things too personally, it's really all about you and not about them. So don't take anything personally.
It's
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Yeah, it's caused by the trap of self-importance, and I think he describes that very well in his book. And too many times we see things through our own world, and we think that everything's going on around us. It's about us, but that's really what's going on with all the people that are around us as well. They're in the same dream, really, and so we have to understand that. Again, it's this idea of being immune from taking on the garbage or the toxic effect of other people's word. Don't take things personally. Kind of liberates you from the toxins of what's out there.
Yeah, it's about opening up your heart and being open, and you don't have to be afraid of being ridiculed or rejected. There's when you're young, we talk about these agreements. You come home with a report card and you got a B+ on your math test, which was very, very hard. And parent A says, "Oh boy, if you study harder, you could have gotten an A." Now, is that being impeccable with their word? Is that, what kind of hurtfulness does that cause a child to make an agreement that that even though they did their best, that it wasn't good enough? So it's a very complex complex thing to do. It's a very simple concept, but it's one that you have to practice a lot.
Right. And the wisdom of this book, as we talked about at the beginning, is that, it sounds so simple, but it really is. But at the same time, it's difficult. Right. Be impeccable with your word. Oh, okay. Just be honest. Well, but be impeccable with your word. Don't take things personally. Sounds like a simple thing to do, but in practice, it's one to really just constantly remind yourself about, as don't take things personally is really one of the great forms of freedom. The other one that is a great form of freedom is the third agreement, and that is don't make assumptions, or as I like to call it, never assume. And you can ask my wife Sonia. I use that phrase a lot because it's really one of my favorite ones in the practice of life. Is too often, because our brains are programmed to protect us and to find dangers and to help us survive, we're too often trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and very often we don't have all the facts, but our brain is quick to make assumptions about what we don't have and what this Toltec wisdom is saying is that that's when a lot of unnecessary drama comes into our lives, is when we have partial information, we then make assumptions, and we're probably taking things personally when we're doing it. And it just becomes a lot of unnecessary drama. And 9 times out of 10, when there's drama in your life, I'll bet you it's because that you violated this agreement. Never assume.
Yeah, I think this is the gateway agreement to all of the other agreements, if you ask me, because it is very programmable that we make assumptions that because we've, let's say, been married for 30 years or 15 years or even 1 year, that we know what the other person wants or they're thinking, or they should know what we're thinking. And it really is a communication blinder. It really can make things become unclear when you make assumptions about what other people want, what they think, even what you want and what you think based on other things. So this is a really tough one. We make assumptions in all kinds of circumstances, when we're listening, when we're not listening, when we think we understand something, we lock that in, or even when we don't understand something, we lock that in too. So
Right. And it's definitely true in romantic relationships. It's also true in friendships. It's true with people on the street, and it's very true in working circumstances. I would say 9 times out of 10, when there are difficulties in communication, difficulties in relationships of any sort, it's usually because you're assuming. And the best way to really to stop the cycle of assuming is to ask more questions, right? You don't want to just take partial information, make an internal assumption, and then go off. When you're there, ask, get clarification. It's part of a healthy relationship to ask questions, and it's part of healthy living to not assume, because too often, because of the way our brains are programmed, we assume the worst. And so just this idea of not assuming, in conjunction with not taking things personally, along with being impeccable with your word, you're going to go through life and it's going to be a lot more fun, because you're not going to be involved in this cloud of all this drama. And that kind of leads us into our fourth agreement,
I
Vince.
was just going to say, you're getting the building blocks here for agreement number 4, which is always do your best. And you notice that it doesn't say always be perfect, or always you're always going to do your best once you decide to understand this agreement. But this agreement really speaks to for instance, if you try too hard to do something that's more than your best, you're going to spend more energy than's needed. And in the end, it's just, it's not going to be good enough. And your best will change from moment to moment. It depends on how you feel, who you are, who you're with. And, there's no way that you can, feasibly judge yourself if you do your best. If you got that B+ in math, and you did your best, and parent A is saying it wasn't good enough, but if you can somehow find a way to say, well, I did my best and I'm happy with that, then you're going to have a lot better of a life. And it's about forming your own agreements, it's about living fully, and it's also about taking action, and if you do your best, then you're in good shape.
Right. That's what he calls this agreement. It's really the action agreement for the 3 previous agreements. And it doesn't mean being perfect, just like he describes in the first chapter, or in the first agreement rather, where you be impeccable with your word. We can't always be impeccable with our words. Sometimes we're going to mess up. And that doesn't mean that we should beat ourselves up, because sometimes you're grumpy. Sometimes you're sick. Sometimes your best is going to be a little different than when you're energetic or when you're feeling positive. but our internal compass knows what our best is. And as you said, it isn't about overdoing either. And he gives a great example in his book. Actually, Vince, do you mind? I wanted to
No,
read
no,
real
read
quick.
along. Please do.
And why not? What book report would be complete if we don't have a little bit of a synopsis of the way it goes? And this really gets to the heart of doing your best. There was a man who wanted to transcend his suffering, so he went to a Buddhist temple to find a master to help him. He went to the master and asked, "Master, if I meditate 4 hours a day, how long will it take me to transcend?" The master looked at him and said, "If you meditate 4 hours a day, perhaps you will transcend in 10 years." Thinking he could do better, the man then said, "Oh, master, what if I meditated 8 hours a day? How long will it take me to transcend?" The master looked at him and said, "If you meditate 8 hours a day, perhaps you will transcend in 20 years. "But why will it take me longer if I meditate more?" the man asked. The master replied, "You are not here to sacrifice your joy or your life. You are here to live, to be happy, and to love. And if you do your best in 2 hours of meditation, but you spend 8 hours instead, you will only grow tired, miss the point, and you won't enjoy your life. Do your best, and perhaps you will learn that no matter how long you meditate, you can live, love, and be happy."
Wow. That's a great example. So true. So true. So true.
Yeah, it's a sliding scale, but it's one that is an internal thing that and I think it's a great way to kind of talk about the four agreements and segue into what So his book isn't just jumping into the four agreements and then it's over. It's a discussion of how we get into these agreements that are bad for us and a new way to go forward. And then he discusses, once we have these agreements intact, what we can do with them going forward in life. And I think he calls that the Toltec path to freedom, right, Vince?
In order to break the old agreements that we've been programmed with and agree to the four new ones, he says there's three masteries that we must gain, and this is where your personal journey is really going to begin. If you haven't read this book and you get to this point, these are the things that really help focus that's awareness, knowing who we are and knowing what the possibilities are, transformation, the ability to change and be free of the domestication, and intent to live life itself, and is an unconditional love, which is, again, more of a practice, and you can't be perfect always, but just be aware that you have this fog in your mind, and that there's some self-limiting fear ground beliefs that can hold us back. So
Right.
I think this by doing this, you can occupy the space left by the old agreements with the new ones, and you're going to fail from day to day, but the more you fail and the more you jump back to these agreements, the better you get each day. It's a one day at a time kind of approach. So
Right. And I think, obviously we could talk about those three things that we need to incorporate to practice these four agreements. Awareness is a big one, I think, right? Because, you got to remember when you're assuming. You got to remember when you're taking things personally. You got to remember when you're letting these old fear-based agreements cloud your judgment. And so that's a great one, awareness. And then being willing to transform and to change. That's the next one, because we get very caught up and stubborn about the way we do things. I mean, we could be 20 years old and pretty happy with the way we're living life. You could be 63 years old like us and be pretty happy with the way we're living our lives. But the willingness to transform is something that we should be embracing regularly, and then setting your intent to doing that. So right, exactly. I don't know. I think it's a great book to start a new year, and if you haven't read it yet, it's a great time. It's kind of bittersweet too, because the author has been going through some health problems, hasn't he, Vince?
yeah, he has, and I was a bit surprised. In December, I do follow the Don Miguel Ruiz Facebook page, And on December 14th, there was this post that says, as many of you know, Don Miguel was on the heart transplant list, and the day has finally come for him to have his surgery. And I thought, well, wait a minute, this is kind of nuts, because he's already had a heart transplant. He actually had a heart transplant in 2010. Apparently, he didn't always have a great ticker. In 2002, he had a near fatal heart attack. He was in a coma for about 9 weeks. And when he woke up, he decided he wanted every day to be a romance. That's his words. And he actually wrote a great book about that called The Toltec Art of Life and Death. And that's the story of the journey he undertook while suspended between this world and the next. And I would say that if you've read the Four Agreements or any of his other books, this is a really, really personal book, and it's great. It's even very wisdom guiding. But yeah, we hope that everything goes fine for him. His family says they can't see him for a couple of months because of the heart transplant,
yeah, the protocol. Yeah, protocol against infection and that kind of thing. Oh, yeah, prayers go out to him, and all of the Don Miguel Ruiz fans out there, I'm sure, are praying, and if they know about it, are praying, and our prayers will be with him for sure.
Yeah, and so I think this is a great start to 2003 Friends in Wonder. Just encourage you, if you haven't read the book, to give it a chance. There's some criticisms out there about it being all new agey and all that, but the reality of it is that it's based on ancient wisdom. And the book was published in 97, long before social media and Facebook and Twitter became the mainstay in many of our lives. So it's sort of the foundation of a lot of new age offspring, but it's all based in very sound practice. I mean, Jesus called it heaven. Buddhists call it nirvana, and the Toltecs call it a new dream. So it's all about humans and humans doing their best.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Vince. It's a beautiful book, and I wish nothing but the best for Don in his health struggles. I know he's getting up there in age, and he's done an awful lot to make the world a better place. And anybody who criticizes this book, I think, is probably needs to read it again. Because it's a beautiful book, and it's one that I think the simplicity is probably the greatest criticism, but at the same time, it's also its greatest wisdom.
And the good news is that he has two sons that are carrying on his tradition. And Joe, I'm going to make a commitment to you, and I'm going to make a commitment to my lovely wife, Sheila, and all of my friends and family, that I am going to really practice these four agreements in 2003.
Well, good for you, Vince. I'll be keeping a close eye on you. Don't assume that I won't be.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. As always, feel free to send us feedback at talk@friendsinwonder.com. You can find us on all of the podcast platforms, and we wish each of you a happy 2003.